Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the latest statements flying around the UN in respect to the siege of Gaza, and also the domestic focus on calls for a ceasefire from the UK in terms of what that means exactly and what the consequences are. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So the UN is still trying to put out a binding resolution on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The Security Council is unable to agree the wording because although all members seem happy to call for an end to activities which are killing Palestinian civilians in Gaza, some countries are saying, look, we need a statement which condemns Hamas so that we're making it clear this is not one-sided. And other ones are going, no, we refuse that. However, a statement has been voted on from the General Assembly. These aren't binding, unlike a Security Council resolution. But nobody vetoes them either, so they can just go to a vote. The general statement, which was voted through, calls for a humanitarian truce, as well as the provision of essential supplies to civilians in Gaza, and for those supplies to be uninterrupted. It won majority support, as I say, but many countries, including the UK, abstained because, again, the amendment calling for the condemnation of Hamas for its actions failed to pass, which of course results in a lot of childish name-calling on all sides. Some will say that nations such as the UK are being pathetic for abstaining on a statement which they formally agree with, because for the avoidance of doubt, the UK's official position is very much in line with that the statement which originally came from Jordan. You know, the UK's position is that hostilities should cease and that essential supplies should be re-established. But for those who disapprove of the abstention, it's not clear to me why they minded a simple statement condemning Hamas to be included. Why wouldn't you just do that? Frankly, I think that this is just silly politicking all around. And I keep saying it should not be difficult to condemn the deliberate killing, torture and capture of Israeli civilians at the same time as condemning the reckless killing of Palestinian civilians. Anyone who is unable to do that is saying that some civilian lives are valuable and others are not. But that is the international clown show. What about specifically in the UK? Well, there's a lot of political heat within Labour, not so much the country at large. The country at large is getting on with this, but within Labour about calls for a ceasefire. Now, being clear that before I get on to what they actually even mean by ceasefire, because you think it'd be obvious, but it's not at all obvious. There are three groups of people calling on Keir Starmer specifically to push for this ceasefire. The first group are like the Momentum crowd. They will look for any excuse to attack the Labour Party, but they can also be readily dismissed as bad faith actors who are using this as an excuse just to rescue their failing finances. There's always a grift for people like this. Second are those who are a bit more genuine. They are sensitive to the views of those they represent. So, for example, we know there are a lot of Labour councillors as well as other politicians, including the Mayor of London and Manchester, calling for the ceasefire as a sort of path of least resistance for their own position. But then third, the ordinary members of the public who cannot abide the dreadful loss of life. They see, well, the only way to stop it is a ceasefire. Absolutely. And so they can't understand why our political leaders are not calling for one. And it's really important to note that this last group are a genuine group, right? But they're also the most numerous. But first, it has to be made clear what a ceasefire even means. People say, well, there should be a ceasefire. What does that mean? Might sound obvious. Well, you cease the firing. But who does? For example, it's already the position of both Rishi Sunak, who's more important because he's the Prime Minister, but also Keir Starmer, that there should be ceasefires. That is already their position. So it's like, well, why are people calling for these leaders to call for a ceasefire if they already are? Well, because it's what do you mean by a ceasefire? Those calling for it don't want the ceasefires for humanitarian reasons, or pauses, as both Starmer and Sunak are referring to them. So what Starmer and Sunak are referring to are pauses, which is ceasefires to allow either civilians to move to safer areas or for humanitarian aid to get in where they're unable to do so. Whereas people go, no, what we mean is a permanent ceasefire. It's like, yes, okay. So a permanent ceasefire is, of course, the only way to stop the tragic waste of innocent lives right now. So would absolutely be the right policy if we could enforce it, if we could achieve it. However, there are two big issues with this call for a ceasefire, which those calling for it seem unable to answer. And I know because I've spent all morning listening to people arguing with me about it. So the first issue is such a ceasefire would, of course, require an actual ceasefire would require Hamas to return all of their hostages and to stop their attacks on Israel. Now, are the people calling for this ceasefire calling specifically for Hamas to also ceasefire and to return hostages? No, they're not. So what they really mean is that the Israeli government should stop its attack and that they accept that Hamas is going to keep the hostages and carry on firing rockets into Israel. I've not seen one proposal for a ceasefire from any of the usual quarters that calls for a ceasefire on both sides, which gives you some idea about how disingenuous the calls are from those major voices. But the second problem is more acute. I mean, neither Labour nor the Conservatives have any issue with calling for an encompassing ceasefire. Indeed, Sunak said in PMQs this week that that was his aim. The problem is, how do you achieve it? Will the UK government, much less the leader of the opposition of the UK government, calling for a full ceasefire from Israel result in that ceasefire? No, it will not. Is there anything we have as leverage over the Israeli government? No, not a thing. Some have cited the fact that we supply them with weapons. We don't. It is true that private arms manufacturers in the UK sell to Israel, and it is also true the UK government could order them to stop. But that isn't leverage. Israel are not in need of those arms for their operation. They already have the stockpiles they need, and when they need to replenish them, they will just buy them elsewhere, most likely the United States. We can have a different conversation about whether we really support a private arms industry in the UK, given that the only people who ever buy them are those who intend to use them to take lives, which generally means the majority of them end up being used against civilians. So I would not argue against that, but that is a completely separate issue, has no bearing here. If we were to block the sale of arms from Britain to Israel, we do not diminish their military capacity in the slightest, not by a single bullet. So is there any other leverage we do have? No. Or at least I have not been able to find any, and I've not had any response from anyone arguing with me that suggests we do. So we must work on the principle that the UK has absolutely no way to force the Israeli government to do anything. Now, at this point, some people may accept that and say, well, look, it's about showing where we stand. Fine. So we call for a ceasefire. We do the same to Hamas, and then we are roundly ignored by both sides. But at least we've made our position clear. That's the right thing to do, isn't it? Well, if the consequence of that would just being ignored, I would say yes, absolutely. But that is not actually the consequence. In reality, the Israeli government would do its nut, and they would then cut us out of conversations with them. And this is not speculation. We've seen it this week, when the UN Secretary General tried to put some responsibility for this mess on the Israeli government as well. Even though he specifically condemned Hamas at the same time, the Israeli government went ballistic and blocked visas for UN representatives. So, yeah, a completely proportionate response there. So if the UK government made any call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, which is what is being called for, then we would get the same treatment. So why would this matter? Well, although we can do nothing to prevent the siege of Gaza and the resultant loss of life, we are trying to get humanitarian aid in. Sunak made clear in Parliament this week that the UK government is urging restraint from Israel and for temporary ceasefires for humanitarian purposes. And you could look at that and say, well, we're not having very much success, are we? No, exactly. The fact that we're having such little success in this regard only goes to highlight just how weak a position we are in should we demand something much stronger from the Israeli government. But over time, we have a reasonable chance of being able to get that humanitarian aid in, but only by chipping away at the Israeli authorities. And that aid will save some lives. It will be small compared to the number of lives being lost. And there are going to be many lives lost. But it will be some lives. Now, if we call for this one-sided, unconditional ceasefire, we lose that capacity. So the actual situation is as follows. If we call for this ceasefire, even one which does call for reciprocal action from Hamas, which no one calling for a ceasefire is talking about, we lose our ability to supply any humanitarian aid because we know Hamas will ignore that. So the Israeli government will tell us to piss off. Innocent Palestinians will still die at the same rate, and we will fail to help any at all. Or we take our current position and put our efforts into saving the lives we can. Now, as I see it, and not one single person arguing against me has been able to point out an alternative, calling for a ceasefire in the terms that the supporters understand means more Palestinians' lives being lost just so that a few people 2,000 miles away can feel a bit better about themselves. And if people think there is a way to call for this ceasefire and save more lives than our current position, I am all ears. I would be very supportive. Let us hear it. But I haven't heard anything yet. And it can't be based on magic spells or pretending that anyone in the world, much less either Israel or Hamas, will do as we say without a clear explanation as to exactly what leverage you think we have over them. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.